This is a narration of the first of 4 parts in a U.S. Sailing Introduction to Sailing slideshow. These are the chalk talks that go along with the Start Sailing Right curriculum, sponsored by U.S. Sailing, and it's recorded for sailors at Yellow Creek State Park, community sailors, and members of IEP Sailing. If you'd like to see these slides rather than reading them in the video, you may download them at friendsofyellowcreek.org. So at Yellow Creek, we sail the JY-15, and most beginning sailing, small boat sailing classes sail similar boats, sloops or centerboard dinghies, small boats 13 to 15 foot in length that may suit 1 or 2 people and usually have 2 sails. Here's a clip of the JY-15. This is in California. A little bit more breeze and waves than we typically have in Western Pennsylvania, but a great example of the fun that you can have if you're a skillful sailor of a boat such as this one. You can see the skipper and crew hiking out to counterbalance the force of the wind. One of the characteristics of a non-keel boat is that the humans are the ballast. If you're participating in Learn to Sail at Yellow Creek as a community sailor or an IEP student sailor, this presentation will help you get some of the knowledge or the theory behind the practice of small boat sailing. And if you choose, you can keep track of your progress towards certification in the famous U.S. Sailing Red Book, where 14 skills are enumerated, and you can check them off as you progress through the curriculum. When you've mastered all of those sails and a certified instructor has signed off, you can submit it to U.S. Sailing for your official certification, if you'd like. And this standard is recognized nationally as proof that you have mastered basic level 1 sailing skills. So in this video, we'll look at 4 aspects of beginner sailing: the wind, the boat, both its parts, the elements of the boat, and the physics of sailing, capsize recovery, and some basic knots. So it's obvious that wind is an important part of sailing. We can't sail without the wind, and one of the things that beginning sailors learn quickly is to pay attention to the wind and to become aware of where it's coming from and what its strength is. In this cycling GIF, you can see 2 sailors experiencing a puff of wind that heels their boat over, and then they quickly move their bodies outboard to counteract it and flatten out the boat. You also see in this right picture a JY-15 sailing at Yellow Creek in some heavier wind conditions. So, thinking about wind, obviously sailboats can't sail directly into the wind, but as we get skilled in tacking, we will be able to sail in almost every direction except directly into the wind. So we can make progress upwind as well as downwind. In order to do that, we are required to have wind awareness, which is to say, knowing where the wind is coming from and learning to develop a fairly accurate sense of not only where it is, but whether it's shifting and whether it's strengthening or diminishing. This happens quite frequently on small lakes where your wind will vary. It's not constant. So this adds a little bit of extra challenge for the beginner sailor. So how do we identify wind direction and strength? What are the clues? A weather report might tell us what the prediction is over the course of an afternoon or a day or a week, but that doesn't necessarily help us at the moment that we launch a boat from the shore and head out into the water. You think of some of the obvious signs that you might pay attention to. Here are a few clues or a few visual representations of things we might look to. So you can see Um, palm trees illustrated here, but pine trees and maple trees, anything with leaves, grass, they tend to bend in the wind. If you have smoke from a chimney, campfire, that gives you an indication. Um, if you have long hair, some of our sailors actually find they bring their own wind indicators. The sails of the boat itself will give you some indication, as might a windmill. And probably the most common sign that we pay attention to when we're sailing is the water itself. Um, Once you begin to pay attention to it, it gives you a sense of, especially whether the wind is strengthening or weakening. And if you're looking towards the direction the wind is coming, it will even give you forewarning of a change in wind speed. So we do need to always be paying attention to this on the water. It's not a bad idea to check a forecast before you go out to sail, but you're always scanning the actual environment that you're in and looking to see whether it corresponds with what the weather predicted. We may have local conditions, or the weather may have changed. Um, as well, you'll begin to develop a little bit of a more refined sense of exactly how strong the wind is. And this is important for a number of reasons, but one of them being that while we need some wind to sail, as the wind intensity builds, it may become more challenging for a beginner to sail. And some boats are more suited than others to sailing in high wind speeds. So you also want to know when there's too much wind for you to sail at that day, or when it's time to take a break for a while and see if the weather abates. Here's a fairly famous depiction of different wind conditions. You probably won't memorize the Beaufort scale, but it's kind of useful to know that these first four levels, force 0 through 3, so winds from 0 up to 8 to 12 miles per hour, or 9 to 10 knots. That's sort of the zone that the beginner sailor wants to experience, especially maybe in this zone, zone 2. 6, 7 miles per hour is enough wind to move your boat nicely, to not be sitting baking in the sun, but also not to create a sense of excessive danger or challenge. Um, More experienced sailers commonly will sail in force 4 or 5, up to 20 some miles per hour, but it begins to get quite challenging in force 5. There are some boats that may not be suited for that, or you may need very experienced crews so that you can both react quickly. The main difference in sailing in these wind speeds is that you have to be able to react much more quickly, and a mistake or a miscalculation is more likely to cause a capsize in those sort of conditions. Very few sailors will actually desire to sail in force 6 or 7. Uh, Once you're getting up to above 25 miles per hour, those are highly challenging conditions. Even skilled sailors may find that the boat is unstable. You'll typically need to reduce your sails, perhaps only sail with one sail, or you might put on a smaller sail if your boat is so equipped. So we're probably going to avoid those sorts of conditions because it can be somewhat of a challenge. So this is just kind of a picture, and the other thing I like about this illustration is it's showing you sort of how some of the environmental factors, the trees, the smoke, the boat itself, the waves, the flag, change under different conditions. So we're always kind of looking and listening and even feeling with our face and our hands the intensity of the wind, and kind of keeping a mental note of what direction it's going. Um, if a storm is approaching, you may find the wind is building from force 2 to force 3, and if you have a sense that it's going to keep building, you should be getting off the water if you're a beginning sailor, so that you don't get caught out in even heavier winds. So that's pretty much a preview of what goes on in with wind and our awareness of it. Here's just an example of a boat that was deliberately sailing in force 6 conditions, so above 25, 28 miles an hour. And they are trying to pick up, this is not actually a human, it's a sailing dummy for the purposes of practicing rescue. But you can kind of get a sense of the challenges involved here. This boat is heeling fairly significantly, bashing through the waves, even though the sail has been partially furled to reduce its sail area. So they're going to have a challenge picking that sailor up out of the water. So as you progress in your sailing skills, you may want to choose to challenge yourself to sail in stronger and stronger wind conditions, but it's something that you should work towards gradually. This is certainly not the kind of condition that a beginner sailor would want to start out on. So the second bit of this first video has to do with learning about the boat. And for new sailors, the jargon of boat sailing, of sailboats, and the terminology, the special names for the parts can be perhaps a little bit overwhelming. While this can be maybe a bit of an impediment at first, or intimidating for the beginner sailor, it is worth trying to learn the specific names that sailors use. It allows you to rig your boat more accurately. It allows a skipper and a crew to communicate about things that might need to be done. And it helps you to understand how the boat works and how to optimize it for fun and for performance. It's not a convenient thing if in a very quick a moment of needing to make a quick decision, one sailor says to another, grab that rope. No, the other one. No, the other one. We want to know specifically what we're talking about when we communicate with other sailors. I guess theoretically, if you sailed only by yourself, only on your own boat, you could forego that. But even then, it would be hard to really learn to be a good sailor, because you wouldn't be able to talk to others with any particularity about what you're experiencing. So one of the things that we pay attention to in boats is sort of how the main parts of the boat contribute to our sailing experience. And in this quick video, which is worth watching in its entirety at some point, we'll see a little bit about how the foils in a sailboat work together. So you may not think about sailboats and airplanes as having anything in common, but in fact, a sailboat has a number of wing-like structures or foils. The most important and most obvious of them are the sails, and it's important to understand that they work like an airplane wing. The wind curves around them, and by moving around the curve on the backside of a sail, it actually creates lift if it's tuned in the right way. So just like an airplane wing, the angle that the sail takes to the wind is quite important for it to work effectively. So the technical name for that effect is called the Bernoulli effect, and you can see this gentleman blowing on the top of a piece of paper and showing how that creates lift. So that's what happens on the back of a sail in a sailboat. But this, if it's angled properly to the wind. But of course, we don't want our sailboat to just sail sideways. So there's a force that's operating in one direction, the lift on the sails. And then the counterbalancing force on our sailboats are the underwater wings, the underwater foils. And those are called a keel, or in the case of our boats, a centerboard or a daggerboard. They have a similar shape to the curvature of the sail, and the water flows over them and creates a countervailing lift. So you have your sails up top and your keel or centerboard down below, creating a kind of a balance and causing the sailboat to move forward if everything is properly tuned. Of course, we can adjust the sails, and we can also adjust the foil that's at the back of the boat, which is our rudder. So it's actually pivots. The centerboard is usually in place, but the rudder can pivot. And all of those things help us to steer and control the course of the boat. Uh, One final point that is sometimes missed by beginners is that these foils only work if there's actually air or water moving across them. So when you don't have any motion or forward progress in your boat, you can't steer. So you need to keep that boat moving at least a little bit in order for the rudder to work. So definitely, if you're interested in this, go to KQED and have a look at the full video of this. It's quite fascinating. So we'll now take a look at a little more in-depth look at the parts of the boat. Uh, Knowing the names helps you to rig them, helps you to explain if something's broken, helps you to receive coaching and advice from other sailors. And we'll kind of take that in three parts: the hull, the sail, and then the rigging of the boat. You probably won't remember all of these names from simply looking at a PowerPoint slide and watching a quick video. You'll need to reinforce it when you're on the boat. You may also want to look at a diagram now and again to reinforce certain things. So very quickly, the hull is the part of the boat that's in the water. We've already talked about the two foils that stick down underneath it, the rudder and the centerboard or dagger board. We won't get into the difference between those. They're effectively the same thing. Um, if the whole boat facing the outside is the hull, we also have words for the back and front of it, or the stern and the bow. There's just a protective sort of top edge. That's the part of the boat that might contact the dock, hopefully gently. That's called the gunnel. Doesn't It's not pronounced the way it's spelled, but gunnel is the word. Um, and then we mentioned the rudder. It's also worth noting that the rudder is attached to a handle, control stick of sorts. It may be wood or metal, and that's called the tiller. Um, so this is the sort of part of the boat that we think of that's somewhat common to other boats too, right? Power boats also have a hull, a stern, a bow, and a gunwale. So that's the hull of the boat itself. Um, the sails have a number of parts. The most important things to know first are the names of the two sails. So we have a main sail, that's always the bigger sail in a boat. And on a boat with two sails, the forward sail is called a jib. Um, in tall ships, there may be 10, 20, 30 sails that each have their own names. We're fairly simple. Main and jib is what you'll encounter on most small boats. Occasionally, a boat will put up a third sail called a spinnaker, but we'll get to that later. So when you're hoisting the sails, or if you're needing to look at different parts of them, you need to know that the three sides of the sail have separate names. So the front of each sail is called the luff. So this would be the main sail luff and the jib luff. Um, the back of each sail is called the reach, and the bottom of each sail is called the foot. So we have three sides to that triangle: luff, reach, and foot. And then if we want to talk about the very top of the sail, that sensibly enough counterbalances the foot. It's called the head. So we've got head up here and foot here. At the bottom of the sails, there are attachment points, two of them in each of the main and jib. So we call the front the tack. So the mainsail has its own tack. The jib has its own tack. And then the back of the sail, which is also an attachment point, is called the clew. So this would be the main clew. This is the jib clew. One other thing that is common, although not universally so, in mainsails, often they have pieces of wood or fiberglass that stiffen the back edge. So those are called your battens, and they'll typically be in a batten pocket. It's important to know about that because occasionally they fall out, or they need to be inserted before you raise the sails. They can also be broken. So we want to pay attention to our battens when we're rolling. So these sails are giant pieces of cloth, dacron usually, especially engineered sailcloth, and we raise them up and down the mast when we go for a sail. So it's named in this picture. It may also be in the next slide. But the lines that we use to raise the sails and lower them also have special names. They're called halyards. We haul the sail up on an old pirate ship. You would haul it up to the yard, so it's called a halyard, halyard. So the two halyards are named after the sails that they are associated with. So the mainsail has a main halyard, the jib sail has a jib halyard. So those are the main parts of the sail. You won't remember them all at first, but if you start with the head and the foot, the luff and the leech, that's a good place to start. And eventually you'll learn the tack and the clew. So we've talked about the boat, we've talked about the sails, and I guess we've actually given you a preview of the rigging. So here are those halyards again. So this line pulls the jib up, and this line, which runs down to the base of the mast here, will bring the main up. And then on most of our boats, we actually have a set of wires. So these lines here and here, and there's one more in the back of the boat, are pieces of cable, stainless steel wire cabling. And those are called stays. This is the forestay here. And these are called shrouds or side stays. And those three wires keep the mast standing upright. This aluminum pole needs to be held upright and to be quite strong. So it's attached with those three wires. And then the bottom of the mainsail is usually kept in place and stretched out by another piece of metal. This boom is like a stainless steel or aluminum pipe, usually aluminum. It pivots. It's not fixed as the mast is, but it holds the end of the sail out. The boom is very important to know about because it's going to be in motion when you're sailing, and it is close to your body, to your head and shoulders, so you need to be aware of where it is. The last bit of the rigging, we've talked about the wires that hold the mast up, the, the lines, the halyards that raise and lower the sails, and then we have two other lines, and the name of them is somewhat paradoxical for beginners because you might think sails would be called sheets, but in fact, the special lines that control the angle of the sails are called sheets. So we have a main sheet here and a jib sheet here. Not particularly clear in this picture, but the key difference is when you raise the sail, the halyard stays in place and you shouldn't have to do anything with it until the end of the day. Whereas you're going to be actively using these sheets while you sail. Almost at every moment, you'll be trimming them. All right. So we've covered the parts of the boat. This is what it looks like all together. Certainly an awful lot, kind of a confusing mishmash of labels when you first see it. But if you try to learn a few of these parts and consolidate your learning each time you're on a boat, you'll eventually know them all. And you'd be able to fill in a diagram like this without making any errors. So feel free to pause the video at some point or visit this slideshow and see how many of these you can name. Perhaps print it out and write them in as you learn them. That could be another good way to commit it to memory. Good sailors know, eventually learn all of these terms. So that's your challenge. Okay. The third thing we're going to talk about in this section is capsize recovery. And that might seem an odd place to kind of go. We've just got basic sail theory and parts of the boat, and suddenly we're already tipping the boat over. But here's the reason why I like to talk about this early on. Um, in good weather, one of the first things we would do with beginner sailors is purposely capsize the boat. And we do that because we want to teach you how to right it, how to correct from a capsize to recover the boat so that you can enjoy sailing and not be worried about that first capsize. So we get it over with. We teach you how to deal with it. And you learn that while it's not pleasant if the water's cool, it's not a crisis either. And the good thing to bear in mind is that a boat that's chosen well for beginners, like our JY 15, is unsinkable. So it's filled with air and foam flotation. Um, Unlike these boats, our boats actually have a masthead float at the top. So even if they lie down on their side, they can't go any further. So they won't turn 180 degrees. And also our boats are what's called self-bailing. So you don't even have to scoop the water out after a capsize. It flows right out the back automatically. So they're really good boats to learn on. If you're going to capsize, you want to capsize in a boat like that. So let's take a little bit of a look at how capsizing occurs and what we should do when it does occur. So obviously we have this force of wind that's blowing on the sails. And even though the keel or centerboard creates resistance, um, we're going to sail our boats with an angle of heel. So this second boat here in the middle, this balanced boat, is leaning over a little bit, but that's not actually a problem. That's the way sailboats are designed to sail on a little bit of a heel. So this is important to know the term heel because we're not tipping over at that point. If your boat is sailing at 10, 15, even perhaps 20 degrees, it's sailing as it was designed to. And this is very different for someone who's familiar with kayaks or canoes or boats that sail perfectly flat. Um, there's nothing to worry about if a sailboat takes a little bit of an angle of heel. When we get into trouble is if the wind increases so much that the heel becomes excessive, right? When we get to 30 or 45 degrees, then we may start to have challenges. So why does this happen? It may happen because the people on a small sailboat are not haven't distributed their weight properly. So in this illustration, you can see the sailor is on the low side of the boat. So wind is coming at the boat in that direction. And if the sailor were on the high side, the boat would be more balanced. But if people slip to the wrong side, or if they're not thinking about which side they should sit on, then that can cause a problem. And we'll certainly talk a little bit later about ways to avoid that, both or how to respond, how to avoid a capsize, both by what you do with your body, but also what you do with the sails and how you steer the boat. There's a number of things you can do, but we're gonna assume that eventually, at some point, you will capsize. So the important thing to learn is that there's a procedure for dealing with that. So let's take a look at that. The very first thing you want to do if a capsize occurs is make sure that your crew, that both of the sailors are okay. So you want to communicate, and it's actually appropriate to shout fairly loudly. If you've capsized in high wind, it could be a little bit loud, a little bit of confusion. So you don't want to be subtle about it. You want to shout, "Are you okay?" "Yes, I'm okay." "Are you okay?" "Yes." You do a quick check. Because obviously, if someone's tangled up in the boat, if they've banged themselves on the boom as they're falling into the water or something, it's important to take care of your crew member rather than worrying about the boat. There's a couple of different ways to recover. The method that we choose from U.S. Sailing with the JYs is to have the skipper and the crew take on different roles. So typically the skipper would be the more experienced sailor who'd be steering. And so they're the ones who are going to go around the back of the boat and end up on the centerboard. And the crew will be the one who says, I'm going to the gooseneck. So the gooseneck is this place right where the mast and the boom meet. So one of them is going to be in the front of the boat and one around the bottom or backside. Uh, so this sailor right now is just lifting up on the gooseneck. And we're doing that because we want to stay in position, and we're also helping the mast from dipping down into the water. And again, I mentioned RJYs have a masthead float here, so there's no danger of it inverting completely with our boats, but it's still a good practice to have that crew member here holding up the mast a little. So then we've got a diagram where the sailor actually gets on top of the centerboard. That may or may not be necessary. It may be possible for the skipper to simply reach up from the water and put two hands on the centerboard and pull, or they may have to climb partially on it. But obviously, the more weight you can get on it, the more quickly you'll right the boat. And of course, if you can get all the way on there, 100% of your body out of the water, and even move it towards the end of the centerboard, you'll exert more force. It's a lever effect. So in fact, this drawing is not ideal to have the sailor standing in the middle of the centerboard. Is not quite right. This sailor's weight should be out here on the edge a bit more in order to fully exert. It's going to take a little bit for that boat to come up. Oops. It will come up slowly at first and then more quickly. But what you can see is that the sailor continues to exert pressure. It's important not to give up or to stop the work too soon. We need to get the boat all the way upright. And then the crew member was holding on to the straps or the centerboard and allows themselves to get pulled into the boat. So that's key, because when we get the boat upright, we want to keep control of it. So this sailor is maintaining contact with the boat, and this sailor is getting dragged up into the boat. And then, of course, the last thing that we'll do is get sailor number one back into the boat before we sail away. And we will also practice how to assist a sailor getting into the boat by pulling them with their life jacket. Very important, if at all possible, to get one sailor into the boat quickly. You don't want it to capsize again because there's no weight in there. And it's even more important that both sailors remain in contact with the boat at all times. You don't want your boat to sail away from you. And it is possible, if your sails are still trimmed in and you right a boat without getting on board, that it will begin to sail away from you. So ideal to get on board it. So here's a video of a capsize and recovery. I think they do this fairly well. The one thing I don't like is it takes them a little while to actually get going. I think it would be ideal to right the boat a little bit more quickly. So they have light wind, so it takes them a bit to pull it over. You can see the skipper is running around, is sort of scooting around to the back, while the crew member is going to the gooseneck and making sure that the sails are uncleated. And that can be helpful because if your sails are still trimmed in, they might scoop up a little bit of water. And we don't want that to happen. So the other sailor's communicating is saying, I'm at the centerboard. So that means we can get ready to have the boat come upright. And then they're doing one other thing that is not always necessary, but could be helpful, especially if the sailors are lightweight. You can see the crew member is throwing the jib sheet over the top. And the other sailor is going to use that to help right the boat in just a moment. So you can see the sailor is pushing down on the centerboard, getting her legs and weight up there. The boat's almost up, and I think she probably could have just kept that pressure and got it all the way, but instead she's using that line to pull it over the rest of the way. So that's a very good technique to use if you have trouble righting. And the other reason that we practice once or twice with a boat, and you should practice with any new boat that you get a chance to sail, is to know kind of how difficult or easy it's going to be, what technique you might need to use. So on a heavier boat, it might be necessary for both sailors to get on a centerboard. On a light boat, it might be possible for a strong and heavy sailor to right the boat quickly with just one hand, for instance. So you do want to practice that to get a feel for how difficult it will be. Last thing to mention on capsize, if you're interested, once you get some practice in, it is possible to do what's called a dry capsize, where you hop over the boat and time it well and don't even get into the water. It's kind of an advanced level technique, but we do have a video here if you want to see someone doing it. So that's all for capsizing. The fourth part of this lesson is knots. There are hundreds of knots, but really for beginning sailing, you need to know about 4 of them. There's 5 or 6 that are super useful, but you can get away with fewer than that. So I'll quickly show you these. It is really something that you need to practice, and you should practice it quite a bit so that you get very comfortable. You want to be able to tie them quickly. Different people like to learn knots in different ways. For some people, studying a diagram like this one is the most effective way to learn. Some prefer to see like a video and animation of the knot being formed. That can be helpful. There's some great YouTube channels and websites for that sort of thing. And the other approach is to just have a fellow sailor teach you and imitate them step by step. Whatever way that you pick, you will need to practice. You'll want to tie a knot 100 times so that you can do it without thinking. Because when you're on a boat and you need to sail it and a line comes undone, you want to be able to tie it quickly, not have to think about it or take out your phone and Google animatedknots.com to see how it works. This is a very funny video about the trucker's hitch, but I'm not going to take the time to show it to you now. You might look at it in the slideshow on your own. So here is one of the simpler knots, the stopper knot. We use this to keep a line from slipping out. So our jib sheets and our main sheet each have a stopper knot on the end. We call it a figure 8. So it makes a loop, comes behind, over the top, and then through its own haul. And then when we tighten it down, you can see that it looks like a little bit of an 8. This is a pretty important knot to tie in this way. If you just sort of freestyle your own stopper knot, it's quite likely that at the end of the day, it will be hard to get undone. So this knot is designed to stay put until we don't want it to anymore. So that's a good one to practice. Animatedknots.com, great video. We won't take the time to show that right now. Cleat hitch. So when you tie a line to something else, it's called a hitch rather than a knot. And so this is how we might fasten our boat to the dock, or when we raise the sail with a halyard, we might use this to fasten that line in place. So what's key is that you cross around everything once, then you cross over a first time, you cross over a second time, and then the third one tucks in underneath the first. This is perhaps the only hitch that I don't like the way Animated Knots teaches it, because they have you going around and around like 17 times. And that's not generally a good practice because it will take too many times to untie. So definitely practice this one. You'll be doing a lot of cleat hitches. Third one, and probably the most useful, is called the bowline. We use this to attach a line to a sail. You can tie a person to a boat with it. You can tie 2 lines together with it, although there are other ways to do that. This is a super important one. So it involves making 2 loops. It's important that the first loop, the line, crosses over itself. And when the knot is finished, this big loop will remain and this small loop will have collapsed. Some people like to visualize this as a tree, and they tell the story about the hole and the rabbit coming out of the hole and then running behind the tree and then back down the hole. And if we tighten this up here, it becomes a bowline. Very important sailing knot. This one also has the virtue of being strong and very unlikely to come undone when it's under strain or to slip, but still being able to be untied at the end of the day, which is important. Not technically a knot, but you will want to practice how to coil up a line, a length of line. So, for instance, when you haul up your sail, you'll have a bunch of halyard that will be uh, loose there, and you don't want just a tangled mix. So it's important to gather it in loose coils, bringing one hand to the other. And then the last thing you do once you've got a nice set of coils is you do what's called gasketing it. So here we see it wrapping around a few times around the neck, kind of making a turtleneck, if you will. And then a loop goes up through the center and down over the top in this one. There's another way to there are several other ways to gasket, which I can show you. But the key is that you make good loops, and then you give it a wrap around. You take that loop up, either to hang it with that on a hook, on a cleat, or to wrap it down there. And you always want your rope to be coiled neatly and tightened down so that it doesn't get tangled and end up tripping you up, but also so that it can be neatly and quickly undone when it's time for that to be done. You can actually maybe watch this animation and see if it's helpful. That's a fairly complicated one to just visualize with someone describing it. So let's see if that works. So they've got a cleat hitch there, and the extra line is being coiled very slowly, though, quite slowly. So this is a fairly typical scenario where you'd have extra line and you want it to be kind of neatened up in some way, right? Now they're going to take the extra little bit and make a loop around, clever and different way. So they didn't actually loop it around the center. They just looped it once around. As long as it will stay, I guess that would work well. Not my preferred way to do it, but that's interesting. All right. As I mentioned, there are hundreds of knots. We've already just been introduced to the several that are required knowledge for the U.S. Sailing Level 1 certification. You'll see another 3 or 4 knots in fairly common usage. So at some point, you might want to learn the reef knot. We actually use that to tie our main sail down at the end of the day when we're done sailing. We have some straps that we use and we tie with the reef knot. Clove hitch is a good quick way to tie a line to something else, like a railing. And a round turn and 2/2 hitches is similar to a bowline, but ends up with a much smaller loop and can be tightened down in a way so that it's much less likely to slide. So certainly if you get into knots, once you get your basic ones down, it's always nice to learn a new knot for fun use. So I think that's about it for the first lesson. So I'll just give you a brief taste of some sort of aggressive and adrenaline-filled JY sailing. These folks are doing a race, and you can see on a JY we've got a hiking strap here, so when they need to, they can lean out and exert their weight. Now they're changing their direction, so sailing across the wind and picking it up on the other side. Notice the sailor in the front is sometimes sitting on the opposite side of her partner and sometimes sitting on the same side. So they're communicating and changing their weight balance to keep the boat nice and flat and moving. Really good sailors here. Great sailing technique. Moving fast. You can see the nice trail of water behind them. Um, can also see a lot of constant adjusting of the sails, right? They're not just setting it and forgetting it. They're sort of they're in a race, so they're trying to maximize their speed. So really coordinating things athletically and looking constantly to see what adjustments they need to make to keep the boat moving really well. We were talking in an earlier couple of slides about um, uh, the sheets for the sails. So if you notice the the sail in the front, the woman has a jib sheet in her hand, so she's controlling the angle of the front sail, and then the sailor hiding behind her, the male sailor, has the main sheet connected to this mainsail in his forward hand, and then he's steering with his rearward hand. Um, we didn't actually learn the name of this, so he's not holding the tiller itself. Let's go back for just a sec. Um, he's holding what's called a tiller extension. So here's the tiller, and then he's got an extra little extension there that really allows him to pivot um, and uh, and control it from all angles, which we have on our JYs. So this is top notch JY sailing. Uh, so I've gone through this as quickly as I could, hit some main points. You're certainly welcome to look at the slides or also to read Start Sailing Right from US Sailing. It's a great textbook and it will help you master all of this if you choose to. And I think that's all.